This is the RDU on Stage podcast. I'm Lauren Van Hamert, your host, and on this episode, I'm chatting with Carly Prentis Jones. It was just about a month ago that the 75-foot statue of a Confederate soldier that loomed over the Capitol grounds in downtown Raleigh for over 125 years was taken down. Ushering in that moment with music were two artists, Shauna Tucker and Carly Prentis Jones. For them, using the music of their ancestors to mark that historic day was more about contextualizing its significance than putting on a show. In fact, for Jones, music and artivism is just part of her DNA, and that is where our conversation begins.
I was an only child for 8 years, and so I have very clear memories of putting on little concerts for my friends and family. I don't know if you remember the show Star Search with Ed McMahon, but I used to watch that show, and I remember always getting on top of this tree stump that my grandma had in her front yard, and I would act like I was Ed McMahon, and then I would go off the stage and I would act, and then I would come back on with a stick as a microphone, and I would sing from this tree stump from a very, very young age. I knew all of the Whitney Houston songs on the Bodyguard soundtrack. I definitely was always singing. Yeah, and I was always in choir in middle school and in high school. And then I really fell in love with musical theater. My dear aunt, my Aunt Fern, she worked on Wall Street and she lived in New York City. And I remember visiting her, and she took me to my first Broadway play, which was Beauty and the Beast. It had all the special effects. It was very cool. And she kind of introduced me to New York and Broadway, and I would go and visit her often, and I was exposed to that world. And so, yeah, in high school, I delved into musical theater, and I think I fell in love with musical theater and the stage because I could be anyone I wanted to be on stage. And it was just such a magical place for me. And it was a place where I didn't feel different. It was a place where I felt like my differences were embraced, which, middle school and high school can be hard for lots of kids. Now, don't get me wrong. I did a lot of things. I ran for student council and I was Miss Extracurricular. But I always felt a little bit on the outside. I grew up here in Raleigh, went to Leesville High School, and I had, there was not a lot of diversity there at my school at that time. And I always felt like I was living kind of on a balancing beam. I wanted everyone to be my friend. I've always been that way. I wanted to be friends with the Black kids and the white kids. And I grew up in an interracial family. My mom is white, my dad is Black, with both parents in the household. So, we talked about race all the time. I mean, it was just something we talked about, not deep conversations about race, but it was, my parents kind of raised me, explained to me that I was both and that I was a blend of them. But that's not the world that we live in, right? So so that was at times very difficult, especially as I got older into high school. Who do you date? What side of the court do you sit on when you watch the basketball game? Where do you sit at lunch? And it's a constant test, and you feel like you're constantly trying to prove like one side or the other, like to different people, like, oh no, see, I do have Black friends, I do have white friends. But on stage, I felt like none of that mattered. None of that mattered. I could just be Carly, and I didn't have to prove anything to anybody. Or I could be, and I could be not just Carly, but I could be anyone I wanted to be, and I could be loud. I was always a loud child. I was always a talkative child. Anyone who knows me now, I always have plenty to say, and so that was celebrated on stage. And so that's where I really fell in love with it. I really fell in love with musical theater when I got into high school.
So, how do you identify yourself?
Right. So I think for anyone coming from a interracial family, I find this to be a very personal question. I think that anyone that you ask, because no one, we are not a monolith, and everyone has their own journey on how they identify themselves when they come from a mixed background. Right now, and I think this is what I've grown into is I would call myself a Black biracial woman. So I grew up being comfortable with calling myself mixed. I've also talked to folks with my background who feel very uncomfortable with the word mixed. It sounds like a tossed salad or something. That's what my sister says. She doesn't like that term. She calls herself blended, which is a whole nother word that I haven't ever heard anyone else use. But like I said, to each their own. But I really have learned over the years that even though I was raised, and my parents, I believe my parents did a beautiful job raising us. I think that, especially here in the South in the 80s and 90s, I think my mother kind of went about it as, oh, you're both, you're the best of both worlds, and wanting to just be very truthful, because that is accurate. I am half white. I have white grandparents, white aunts and uncles and cousins that I'm still very connected to. I also have a whole Black side down here, aunts, uncles, cousins. And I was raised with both Christmases, both Thanksgivings, both kinds of churches, both. And I think if you ask somebody from an interracial background where they are not connected to one side, like I dated a guy in high school who is also biracial, but his white grandparents spit on him when he was born. So, of course, he didn't really identify at all with that side of the family. So, I think it really depends on where you come from, what kind of family you come from. But as I got older, I'm never going to walk through the world as a white woman. That's just not ever going to happen. Right. So, although, yes, I am half white, and a part of me for a long time struggled with, I always wanted to call myself mixed or biracial because I felt like saying that I was Black meant that I was disowning my mother or disowning my whole white side of the family. But I have now lived and I have changed my belief on that, because I identify very much with Black culture, and I will always be looked at as a woman of color. Now, people, as I walk through the world, think I'm all kinds of things. They most of the time I get Puerto Rican, which is I've not none of that in there. So that's why I go by I'm a Black woman. So if someone says, "Oh, you're Black," that is accurate. That is true. And so to me, Blackness is an umbrella term. There are lots of different kinds of Black people. My best friend from college is Jamaican. Her parents are from Jamaica, but she was born in Cleveland, right? So she's Jamaican American. If anyone said, "You're not Black, you're Jamaican," she'd be like, "I mean, I'm both," right? So to me, Blackness is an umbrella term that has a lot of different. There are so many different ways of cultural experiences under that umbrella term of Blackness. So I am a Black biracial woman. So biracial is the part that, to me, just gets a little more specific, right? Because I know when people ask me, what's your background? I know what they're asking, right? So I'd rather just cut to the chase. I don't want you to have to go guess. So I call myself a Black biracial woman.
And this leads me to kind of my next question. So we had kind of our precursor conversation to this interview and getting to know each other a little bit more. We had a really long talk about colorism, which is something I have not really thought about and something I didn't really understand or know about. So, how has being Black and biracial either helped or hurt your career, particularly when it comes to getting cast in certain roles?
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, I think I fell in love with the stage because my differences were embraced on stage. And whereas in the real world, I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere, not with the Black kids, not with the white kids. I didn't really have a niche, a place. On stage, my racial ambiguity helped quite a bit. I was able to play all kinds of roles. And I'll say that as I got older, colorism is a very deep and real thing in the Black community, in all sorts of communities. And I do know that because I am light skinned, I do have a certain amount of privilege when I walk throughout the world. I mean, not just on stage, in just life in general. We live in a white supremacist society where if you are light skinned and you have more European features, I have long curly hair and light skin, and I'm definitely, when you look at me, you can tell that I am mixed. You can tell that I'm biracial. There are other biracial women that don't exhibit those features quite as much, so we're all different. And I think that affects how we're treated, right? When you look at Mariah Carey, you can tell she is multicultural, right? When you look at Halle Berry, she looks Black. And I'm using this as a very broad brush strokes, right? So because we all come from different perspectives and different places, and we have different visions in our mind of who looks like what, you know? And so anyway, my racial ambiguity really opened a lot of opportunities, I think, for me. And as a younger actor, I took those opportunities. I did. I think I played a lot of roles that didn't have any kind of race or culture assigned to that role. The person that I look up to the most is Audra McDonald because she is a Black woman, and yet she has played all kinds of roles, all kinds of roles. And I've looked up to Audra McDonald since I was in middle school. And I also have the classical training that I remember Audra, she went to Juilliard for opera. And that's how I said, oh, well, if Audra did that, I can do that, and I definitely have always looked up to her. And she was able to sing with this very trained voice, very trained, legit, classically trained voice, and make a career for herself and play whatever character she wanted to do. I also realized that colorism is very real, and white people, and I'm saying this with a broad brushstroke, I think that a lot of white people are comfortable with, there's a reason Barack Obama became our first Black president, right? And not Jesse Jackson. And I know there's a lot into play there. Okay. A lot. Okay. Okay. But I think one of those points is that Barack Obama talked about his biracial background at that Democratic convention before he was even president. He was talking about his truth, which is the fact that he's come from both, right? And I think that Barack Obama is a digestible, or was a digestible kind of Black person for a lot of white people. I know that sounds really awful, but it's the truth. There is privilege. That is the truth. There is privilege that comes with colorism. And so as I've gotten older, I definitely am conscious of that, more conscious of that than I was when I was younger. And whenever there's a play where there is a reason in the plot, or there is a reason it's based off of a historical character that is darker skin, or they're from a particular country, or there's something in the script that they should be a dark skinned woman, I do not take it. I will not take it. I cannot do that, because that to me plays into colorism, right? So, I try to be very conscious of of the roles that I take. And unfortunately, I will say this, unfortunately, there are not a lot of biracial roles. Okay? So, yes, I'm a black woman, and we come in all different shades. But it's interesting, the storylines that are written, and I don't know if it's just because it's too complicated, or America is still coming to grips with that, with biracial people actually saying that they're biracial and not choosing one side or the other. That's why I love, for example, that's why I love the show Blackish and Mixedish, the spinoff. But Blackish was the first time that I had ever seen anyone that was biracial in a black family with, Rainbow, the lead character, Tracy Ellis Ross, who is biracial in real life, plays a biracial woman who is married to this black man and has her black children. She has this lovely, beautiful black family. And she she has I think it was the first episode, which is she's like, "Oh yeah, I'm not black enough. Why don't you tell that to my hair and my ass?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm gonna steal that." And that was the first time I'd ever seen someone. Yeah, there have been nods to those characters in different TV series where maybe somebody's parent shows up as a cameo and it's a white person. You're like, "Oh, that makes sense." But this is like fully explored in Blackish, right? And it was a big deal. It was a big deal when Mixed Dish, the spinoff, came out. And that just happened like last year. So America is coming to grips with that. And when I say America, I mean white America and Black America. Black America has had an issue with mixed folks for a very long time. And I get it. I totally get it, because there are people who are biracial who use their biracialness to run away from their blackness. But once we can all get our heads around the fact that that's not the case always, that we're just embracing everything that we are, then and that doesn't mean that I'm any less black, right? That doesn't mean I'm any less black by saying I am a black biracial woman. Then we can move forward, right? And maybe we can get some storylines written for us on stage as well. But, it's a complicated, as much as privilege, we have a lot of privilege. That is very true. I have a lot of privilege when it comes to that. But I also have been told many times that I don't look black enough for roles. So that's the flip side, right? So, there's always two sides to everything. I either don't look black enough, or and that, yeah. So it's an interesting world to navigate, for sure.
So, for you, what is artivism, and what role do the arts have in moving the needle on social and racial justice, particularly here in the state of North Carolina?
Right. So, I did not coin the term artivism. I wish I had, but I love that term. To me, artivism is using your art for activism or for social justice or social change. Um, and that's any art, that's music, theater, dance, visual art, poetry, the arts. It's self-expression, right? It's the ultimate tool of self-expression. And it can be a very powerful tool when trying to reach the hearts and minds of people. We see that in the theater every day. And oftentimes, I think it can be more powerful than your average political speech, right? So, um, it can really change perspectives. It can amplify voices that are have been traditionally silenced. We have a lot of amazing people who use their art for good in this state. Mike Wiley does, as you know, does incredible work bringing to life the stories that we should have been taught in school but weren't. Howard Kraft, I just finished his play. I can't believe that was this year. It's the longest year ever. But yes, we finished his play, Orange Lights, which was about the fires. It was about workers' rights and a very famous case here in North Carolina. If you remember the chicken plant fires. So that's another wonderful playwright. I will be participating in a workshop reading of 19 by Jacqueline Lawton, which will be amplifying the voices of Black women and really I think that will be a very interesting project because it's diving into the suffrage movement and women's rights and feminism versus womanism. And I think we're going to have some very interesting conversations. There's a lot of division between Black women and white women, and it's historical and goes way far back. And I think that this play really will tackle that and start some conversations. That to me is an example of artivism. Anytime that there is work being created that amplifies the voices of people who have been traditionally silenced or sparks conversation, sometimes we need a show or a song or something to loosen people up enough to start talking. Not exactly give us answers, but give us a perspective and give us something to talk about, something to dig into, something to ask questions about, right? So that's how I would describe artivism. And there are visual artists who do this, and there are it's been interesting. I've seen a lot of the murals painted with Black Lives Matter, and that's a whole nother issue because a lot of folks are saying, oh, these murals, what we really need is policy change, which is very true. Paint is not going to change what is going on right now, and especially let me go back, especially if you just put paint on the streets and change nothing, like they've done in DC. But in Charlotte, for example, what Charlotte did was they paid Black artists, they commissioned a different young artists of color, mostly artists of color. I think there were only two that weren't, to paint Black Lives Matter down the middle of the main drag of Charlotte. So, you're paying Black artists, which I think we should always do. We're amplifying their work, right? One of them just got featured in Elle magazine because of this work. Okay. And she's a young Black woman. Georgie is her name. She's out of Charlotte. So there we go. That's amplified a Black voice, a young Black voice, and many Black voices. And then on top of it, it does make a statement when you see Black Lives Matter painted by Black hands, paid Black hands, down the middle of the main drag of Charlotte, North Carolina, where it's surrounded by a bunch of banks, right? It does make a difference that they have to drive by that every day. Now, does it change anything? No. Does it amplify the message that is in this movement? Yes, it does. Everybody contributes to movements in their own way, right? And there are lots of layers to movements. And artists can participate in these movements just like that. That's a great example, right? Or the Durham Murals project that they did recently for Black Lives Matter. There's lots of things that artists can do to uplift the voices of those who have been silenced, because that's what this entire movement is about, right? Is uplifting the voices and the needs, and the what is going on is unacceptable in our country right now. And the problem is that America has not been listening to Black and Brown voices. And so the arts can be used as a tool to make sure that those voices are heard. Is it the only tool? No, but it's definitely a powerful one.
You and Shauna Tucker made a little bit of news when you began singing and playing music together against the backdrop of the Confederate monument coming down in downtown Raleigh. Can you talk to me about where the impetus to use music in that moment?
Yeah, yeah. Shauna is a very good friend and colleague of mine. And after we did that, we had a lot of people who said, "Oh, why didn't you tell us about this performance of yours?" And, it was not a performance. It was not a performance. It really happened quite organically. We were there on Saturday, the day that many of the other monuments came down at the Capitol. And it was emotional, and we were both very touched. And Shauna said, "Gosh, I wish I'd brought my cello." And I said, "Yeah, I was just singing Lift Every Voice and Sing earlier. I wish I could sing that for real, for real." And she was like, "Well, why don't we just meet tomorrow morning?" Because they were having trouble getting the big one, the really big 75-foot tall monument up off the ground. And she said, "It may not be here when we're here in the morning, but it'll be therapeutic for us. If we just have our own little Vespers session and sing some spirituals, and whatever comes to our mind for the moment." I was like, "All right, that sounds good. Let's do it." I think that would feel good. Because it was very meaningful to me. I have grown up in our capital. I've grown up in this very city my whole life. My grandfather, Dr. Frizzell Jones, was a professor at St. Augustine's College, now St. Augustine's University. And my dad was raised on that campus, that HBCU. My dad later went to Harvard, came back to serve this state as a judge for a long time. And the whole time, those monuments have been up. Those racist monuments have been up, because those monuments were resurrected. A lot of people don't understand this, but those monuments are not relics from the Civil War. They were resurrected long after the Civil War to remind Black people of their place. And the Daughters of the Confederacy and some other folks, those are the folks that are behind those statues and those monuments well after the Civil War. And they surrounded our capital. It's something my grandfather never thought would happen. It's something my father never thought would happen. And so it's really emotional, especially, we're already very emotionally raw by everything that's going on right now, with Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless other Black people. And so Shauna and I met at 6:30 in the morning the next day on Sunday. And sure enough, the officer told us to move out of the middle of the street because a crane was going to be coming shortly for the really big 75-foot tall one. And so we set up on the side. Shauna brought a amp and a microphone, and we just sang whatever came to our minds. And so it was the songs of our ancestors. It was songs like Balm in Gilead and Deep River. And we also sung songs from the Civil Rights Movement, We shall overcome. And of course, we did Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is what we lovingly call the Black National Anthem, because it was therapeutic for us. And we wanted to remind the folks that were there. There was a small gathering there as people learned that that last one was being pulled up. We thought it was important to mark that moment and to remind folks why those monuments were being taken up. And we felt very emotionally connected to what was going on. My father came to watch that one come up. He had tears in his eyes watching it and hearing me sing the Negro National Anthem. And it was very special for us. It was very special. It was our tribute. It was our connection to our ancestors at that time, watching that come up. It was very emotional, and it was our way as artists to give back to that moment. And we did not expect. I mean, there were news cameras there because, like I said, we didn't even know that was going to be coming up at that time, right? We were really just doing that for us. And so, yes, the newspapers and some folks interviewed us about it, but we really just wanted people to remember why it was happening. And that was our way of reminding folks the history, our history. Folks that keep saying it's heritage, not hate, right? These monuments. Well, this is my heritage, singing these songs. This is our history.
I think I'm going to start introducing a word of the month to our audience via social media as a means for everyone to kind of self reflect and explore. And so I want this month's word to be grace. What does grace mean for you as a Black biracial woman, artist, artivist?
I think the first step to having more grace in our lives is being open. That means listening. That means coming into conversations, not assuming the worst in people, but assuming that everybody is there to have a better understanding of one another. I think grace is patience. I think grace is dignity and treating others with dignity and respect, just as you would want people to treat you with dignity and respect. And yeah, just being open. If you don't understand something or someone's perspective, having the openness to explore that and listen. And, for me, I think that means constantly having conversations with friends and family, and also having grace with myself and realizing that Carly Prentis Jones cannot save the world. I think a lot of us Black women struggle with that. Having grace with myself and knowing that, like, it's good to set boundaries. So yes, having the flexibility to talk to people about very hard things, but also having grace with myself and setting boundaries so that I don't get exhausted and wear myself out.
Yes. And I think for so many of us, as we hear stories and listen to people's stories and truths and history, we want to change the world. And as somebody reminded me recently, we're talking about 400 years of oppression, so it's not going to change overnight. We have to give ourselves kind of the grace and space to evolve so we don't get tired. It's a long fight.
Yeah, that is so true. So true. It's important for us all to keep going and to have as much grace and patience as we possibly can as we move through it.
I want to thank Carly Prentis Jones for sharing her story with me and you for listening. If you like what you've heard today, please consider subscribing to this podcast, following us on social media at RDU on Stage, or visiting us online at www.rduonstage.com. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and support your local artists and theaters.